Part 1. The Man I Was Before All This. My name is Raymond Dale Hollister if you want the full picture. I turned 58 the spring before my daddy passed, and I remember thinking that 58 felt like a number that didn't quite belong to me yet. I'd been an electrician my whole adult life, commercial and residential both, and my hands looked it. Calloused, scarred from conduit work, one finger bent at a wrong angle from an old panel mishap back in '98. I wasn't a fancy man, and I never pretended to be. I drove a '9 Silverado that needed new shocks, lived in a 3-bedroom house outside of Cookeville, and spent my weekends either fishing the Caney Fork or watching my daughter's kids tear around the backyard. That was my life. That was enough. My brother Dennis is 2 years older than me, and for most of our lives we got on fine. Not close, we were too different for close. Dennis went to college, got himself a business degree from UT Chattanooga, married a woman named Pam who wore her ambitions like a second skin. They moved to Nashville, built a nice house in Brentwood, drove cars that didn't make noise. Dennis worked in commercial real estate and did well enough at it. I didn't begrudge him any of that. A man builds what he builds. Our father, Earl Hollister, was a stubborn old Scotch-Irish widower who had farmed tobacco most of his life, and then, when his knees gave out, rented the land and collected a modest check every month. He lived in the house he was born in, out on a gravel road off Highway 70, and he intended to die there too, which he did in January of the year I'm talking about at age 82 in his own bed with Dolly Parton on the radio. There are worse exits. Daddy had some money. Not a fortune by any stretch, but more than people expected. The farmland was worth a good deal more than it had been 20 years before. Developers had been circling that county like patient birds, and there was a CD at First Federal, plus the house itself, plus about 60 acres he owned outright. His accountant told us later that the estate came to roughly $940,000, which is not nothing. Especially not to a retired electrician from Cookeville. The will, as I understood it, as Daddy had told me, sitting on his porch the summer before he died, drinking sweet tea and watching the heat shimmer off the pasture, was simple. Split down the middle. 50% to Dennis, 50% to me. That's what he said. He'd always been a fair man that way. He had his faults, he was hard when we were boys, short on praise, long on expectations, but he was fair. Part 2, the paperwork shuffle. Dennis handled most of Daddy's affairs in those last 2 years. I didn't fight it. He was retired by then, had the time, and frankly I figured he'd do it right. He lived closer to Nashville where the accountant was, had a relationship with the family attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who'd drawn up Daddy's original will back in 2011. I trusted the process. That was my first mistake, though calling it a mistake feels too simple. It was more like a failure of imagination. I simply could not imagine my brother doing what he did. What he did was this. Sometime in the 18 months before Daddy died, Dennis arranged for a new will to be drafted. I don't know exactly how he convinced the old man to sign it. Daddy was still sharp in most ways, but he had good days and bad days, and toward the end the bad days were coming more frequent. Whether Dennis caught him on a bad day, or whether he told him something untrue, or whether he just wore him down, I can't say for certain. What I can tell you is what the new will said. 80% to Dennis, 20% to me, with a note explaining that this distribution reflected the greater involvement of Dennis in the management of Earl's affairs. I found all this out the day of the reading, sitting in Gerald Fitch's office in a chair that smelled like old leather, with Pam sitting next to Dennis looking like she'd already mentally spent her share. I kept my face still. I was raised by a man who thought showing pain was a kind of weakness, and whatever else that does to a person, it does teach you to hold a poker face in a crisis. Inside, something went cold and then very hot and then cold again. I nodded at Fitch like he'd just told me the weather. What nobody in that room knew, what I had never mentioned to Dennis, or to Pam, or to Fitch, or to anyone, was that I had a copy of the original 2011 will. Daddy had given it to me himself, folded into a manila envelope that he'd handed me one afternoon in 2019, saying, "Keep that somewhere safe, son. in case anything gets scrambled later. At the time, I thought he was just being careful. I tucked it in the fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet, along with my own documents, and more or less forgot about it. When Fitch read the terms of the new will, that envelope came back to me like a physical thing, like I could feel its edges. Part 3. 2 years of very quiet work. I did not confront Dennis. I want to be clear about that because I know what most men would have done and I understand the impulse. You want to get in somebody's face, you want to make them feel the size of what they've done. But I had a feeling, a slow, certain kind of feeling, that confronting him would only give him time to prepare, to talk to lawyers, to move money, to construct a story. I'd watched enough of the world to know that the first person to get loud is usually the one who ends up looking unstable. So I went home. I called my daughter Leanne and told her I was fine. I called my fishing buddy Carl and told him I needed a rain check on Saturday. And then I sat at my kitchen table for about 3 hours, drinking coffee, and I thought. The first thing I did was drive to Cookville and hire an attorney, not Gerald Fitch, not anyone connected to my father's circle, a woman named Beverly Strand who had a small practice on the second floor above a hardware store and a reputation for not backing down. I brought the 2011 will. I told her everything I knew. Beverly looked at the document for a long time, asked me a series of careful questions, and then said, "This is interesting, Mr. Hollister. This is genuinely interesting." Beverly explained that a later will doesn't automatically invalidate an earlier one if there are grounds to contest, particularly if there's evidence of undue influence or if the testator's capacity at the time of signing can be questioned. She told me we'd need medical records from the period when the new will was signed, and witness statements, and anything else that might establish the circumstances under which Daddy had changed his wishes. She also told me to be patient. This kind of thing, she said, takes time. I was patient. Lord knows I was patient. Over the next 22 months, Beverly gathered what she needed. Daddy's doctor provided records showing he'd been assessed for early cognitive decline in the very window when the new will was signed. The same Dr. Dennis had been present at, supposedly helping his father manage the medical appointments. A former neighbor named Tilly Greer, who'd been close with Daddy in his last years, gave a statement about conversations she'd had with Earl in which he'd expressed confusion about his estate planning and worry that the boys might fight about it. A paralegal at Fitch's office, who'd since moved to a different firm, told Beverly that the signing had been rushed and that Daddy had asked twice to have sections re-explained to him. I kept going to church on Sundays. I kept having Dennis and Pam over for Thanksgiving. I listened to Pam talk about their new lake house at Norris. I smiled and passed the green beans and said nothing. Part 4. The Reckoning in a Conference Room. We filed the contest in the spring. Dennis found out when he was served papers on a Tuesday morning, apparently while he was still in his bathrobe. He called me within the hour, voice shaking between anger and something that sounded almost like fear. I answered the phone and listened to him tell me I was betraying the family, that I was being selfish, that Daddy had made his wishes clear and I had no right. I let him finish. Then I said, "I'll see you in court, Dennis," and hung up. He hired a firm out of Nashville, 3 attorneys, I was told, which I found gratifying in a dark way. If I'd been obviously wrong, he wouldn't have needed 3 attorneys. The mediation took place in October, 14 months after we'd filed. A long conference table, 8 people in the room, a mediator named Howard who had the weary patience of a man who'd seen every variety of family falling apart. Beverly and I sat on one side. Dennis, Pam, and their 2 lawyers sat on the other. I hadn't been alone in a room with Dennis since the funeral, and looking at him across that table, older now, thinner, with something tight around his eyes that I didn't remember being there before, I felt a complicated kind of sadness alongside everything else. He was still my brother. That doesn't go away, even when it should. What happened over the next 6 hours is its own long story. The short version is this. The evidence Beverly had assembled was considerable, and Dennis's team knew it. The medical records alone raised serious questions. By mid-afternoon, Dennis's lead attorney asked for a recess, and when they came back, his opening position of "this contest has no merit" had become, "perhaps there is room for discussion." We settled out of mediation. The final distribution was 60% to me, 40% to Dennis, the opposite of what his new will had specified. Beverly estimated that in a full trial we might have gotten closer to the original 50-50 split, possibly more, but trials are expensive and uncertain, and I was 59 years old and tired. 60-40 felt like justice dressed in practical clothes. I took it. Epilogue: what I want you to know. Dennis and I don't speak now. That's his choice more than mine, though I can't say I've fought hard against it. Pam apparently told mutual friends that I ambushed the family. I've decided that's a word I can live with. The money, my share, came to just over $500,000, went to sensible places. Some to Leanne and her family, some into a retirement account that actually looks respectable now, some to fix the foundation on my house that I'd been ignoring for 4 years. I kept fishing the Caney Fork. The Silverado finally got new shocks. I don't tell this story to make myself sound like a hero. There's nothing heroic about watching your brother try to steal from you. What I hope somebody takes from it is simpler than that. Be careful with trust. Keep your paperwork. Give people enough rope and then be patient about what they do with it. Daddy was a fair man. I just made sure his fairness was the thing that lasted.